This is going to be a study on the 60s and 70s. The 1960s, of course, are in many ways both the best of times and the worst of times. On the one hand, the post-war economic prosperity peaked in the 1960s. At the same time, racial strife, controversial war in Vietnam, and student radicalism started to tear the country apart. The proud superpower began to learn its limits, both in the jungles of Vietnam and the streets at home. The decade began with an election that proved somewhat symbolic of the changes that were to come. President Eisenhower had not been able to transfer his popularity to other Republicans, and the Democrats retained control of Congress through Eisenhower's last 2 years in office. At the 1960 convention, the Republicans unanimously nominated Richard Nixon for president. In a visit to Moscow, he stood up to Nikita Khrushchev in the so-called kitchen debate, which took place in a model of an American kitchen over the relative merits of capitalism and communism. Still young at age 47, Nixon was known to be a tough and seasoned campaigner. Early in 1960, several Democrats believed they had a chance to the nomination. In the primaries, however, a charismatic, wealthy, and youthful 43-year-old senator from Massachusetts, John F. Kennedy, defeated his rivals. To balance the ticket, the New Englander chose a Texan, Lyndon B. Johnson, to be his vice presidential running mate, a choice that proved critical in carrying southern states in the November election. The new medium of television perhaps played the most decisive factor in the close race between the two youthful campaigners, Nixon and Kennedy. Kennedy appeared on screen as more vigorous and comfortable than the pale and tense Nixon. As the first Catholic presidential candidate since Al Smith in 1928, Kennedy's religion became an issue in the minds of some voters. Religious loyalties helped Nixon in rural Protestant areas, but helped Kennedy in large cities. In one of the closest elections in U.S. history, Kennedy defeated Nixon by a little more than 100,000 popular votes, and by a slightly wider margin of 303 to 219 in the Electoral College. At age 43, Kennedy was the youngest candidate ever to be elected president. In his inaugural address, Kennedy spoke of the torch being passed to a new generation and promised to lead the nation into a new frontier. The promises of the new frontier proved difficult to keep. Kennedy called for aid to education, federal support for health care, urban renewal, and civil rights. But his domestic programs sat in Congress. On economic issues, Kennedy had some success. He faced down big steel executives over a price increase he charged was inflationary and achieved a price rollback. In addition, the economy was stimulated by increased spending for defense and space exploration, as the president committed the nation to land on the moon by the end of the decade. With his domestic programs often blocked, Kennedy increasingly turned his attention to foreign policy issues. Kennedy did persuade Congress to pass the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, which authorized tariff reductions with the recently formed European Economic Community of Western European nations. In 1961, Kennedy made a major blunder shortly after entering office. He approved a CIA scheme planned under the Eisenhower administration to use Cuban exiles to overthrow Fidel Castro's regime in Cuba. In April 1961, the CIA-trained forces of Cubans landed at the Bay of Pigs in Cuba, but failed to set off a general uprising as planned. Trapped on the beach, the anti-Castro Cubans had little choice but to surrender after Kennedy rejected the idea of using U.S. forces to save them. Castro used the failed invasion to get even more aid from the Soviet Union and to strengthen his grip on power. Well, trying to shake off the embarrassment of the Bay of Pigs defeat, Kennedy agreed to meet Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev in Vienna in the summer of 1961. Khrushchev seized the opportunity to threaten the president by renewing Soviet demands that the United States pull its troops out of Berlin. Kennedy refused. In August, the East Germans, with Soviet backing, built a wall around West Berlin. Its purpose was to stop East Germany from fleeing to West Germany. In 1963, the president traveled to West Berlin to assure its residents of continuing U.S. support. The Berlin Wall stood as a gloomy symbol of the Cold War until it was torn down by rebellious East Germans in 1989. A different Cold War challenge were the many brush fire wars in Africa and Southeast Asia, in which insurgent forces were often aided by Soviet arms and training. Such conflicts in Laos and Vietnam in Southeast Asia convinced the Kennedy administration to adopt a policy of flexible response, moving away from former Secretary of State Dulles' idea of massive retaliation and reliance on nuclear weapons. Kennedy and his Secretary of State, McNamara, increased spending on conventional non-nuclear arms and mobile military forces. While the flexible response policy reduced the risk of using nuclear weapons, it also increased the temptation to send elite special forces such as the Green Berets into combat all over the globe. The most dangerous challenge from the Soviets came in October 1962. U.S. reconnaissance planes discovered that the Russians were building underground sites in Cuba for the launching of offensive missiles that could reach the United States in minutes. Kennedy responded by announcing to the world that he was setting up a naval blockade or quarantine of Cuba until the weapons were removed. A full-scale nuclear war between superpowers seemed likely if Soviet ships challenged the U.S. naval blockade. After days of tension in this, what was called nuclear chicken, Khrushchev finally agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba in exchange for Kennedy's pledge not to invade the island nation and to later remove some U.S. missiles from Turkey. The Cuban Missile Crisis had a sobering effect on both sides. Soon afterward, a telecommunications hotline was established between Washington and Moscow, making it possible for the leaders of the two countries to talk directly during a crisis. In 1963, the Soviet Union and the United States, along with nearly 100 other nations, signed a nuclear test ban treaty to end the testing of nuclear weapons in the atmosphere. Kennedy had campaigned with a strong appeal to black voters, but he proceeded gingerly to redeem those promises. Although he had pledged to eliminate racial discrimination in housing with a stroke of the pen, it took him nearly 2 years to find the right pen. Political concerns stayed the president's hand on civil rights. Elected by a wafer-thin margin and with shaky control over Congress, Kennedy needed the support of Southern legislators to pass his economic and social legislation, especially his medical and educational bills. He believed, perhaps justifiably, that those measures would eventually benefit Black Americans at least as much as specific legislation on civil rights. But events soon scrambled these careful calculations. Following the wave of sit-ins that surged across the South in 1960, groups of freedom riders fanned out to end segregation in facilities serving interstate bus passengers. A white mob torched a Freedom Ride bus near Anniston, Alabama in May of 1961, with Attorney General Robert Kennedy's personal representative He was beaten unconscious in another anti-freedom riot in Montgomery. When Southern officials proved unwilling or unable to stem the violence, Washington, D.C. dispatched federal marshals to protect those freedom riders. And encouraged by Robert Kennedy and with financial backing from Kennedy-prodded private foundations, SNCC and other civil rights groups inaugurated a voter education project to register the South's historically franchised blacks. And SNCC is the Student Nonviolent Coordination Committee. CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, which we brought up last PowerPoint by James Farmer, had now kind of developed almost the opposite of SNCC, and became more militant and advocated Black power and even racial separatism. Integrating Southern universities threatened to provoke wholesale slaughter. Some disregarded painlessly, but the University of Mississippi, or Ole Miss, just became a volcano. Well, what happened? A 29-year-old Air Force veteran by the name of James Meredith encountered violent opposition when he attempted to register in October of 1962. Finally, in the end, Kennedy was forced to send 400 federal marshals and 3,000 troops to enroll Meredith in his first class, which happened to be colonial American history. He ultimately graduated with a sheepskin that cost the lives of 2 men, scores of injuries, and some $4 million in taxpayer dollars. In the spring of 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. launched a campaign against discrimination in Birmingham, Alabama, the most segregated big city in America. Although blacks constituted nearly half of the city's population, they made up fewer than 15% of the city's voters. Watching developments on television screens, a horrified world saw peaceful civil rights marchers repeatedly repelled by police with attack dogs and electric cattle prods. Most fearsome of all were the high-pressure water hoses directed at the civil rights demonstrators. They delivered with water with enough force to knock the bricks loose from buildings or strip barks from trees at a distance of 100 feet. Jolted by these vicious confrontations, President Kennedy delivered a memorable televised speech to the nation on June 11, 1963. In contrast to Eisenhower's cool aloofness from the racial question, Kennedy called the situation a moral issue and committed his personal and presidential prestige to finding a solution. He called for a new civil rights legislation to protect black citizens. In August, King led 200,000 black and white demonstrators on a peaceful march on Washington in support of the proposed legislation. In an electrifying speech from the Lincoln Memorial, King declared, "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." A couple of pictures of the demonstrations and the attacks on these protesters. And still the violence continued. On the very night of Kennedy's stirring television address, a white gunman shot down Medgar Evers, a black Mississippi civil rights worker. In September of 1963, an explosion blasted a Baptist church in Birmingham, killing 4 black girls who had just finished their lesson called The Love That Forgives. By the time of Kennedy's death, his civil rights bill was making little headway, and frustrated blacks were growing increasingly impatient. On November 22, 1963, while riding in an open limousine in downtown Dallas, Texas, President Kennedy was shot by a concealed rifleman and died within seconds. Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson was promptly sworn in as president's president on a waiting airplane and flown back to Washington with Kennedy's body. Although he mistrusted the Harvards, that's what he called the Kennedys, Johnson retained most of the bright Kennedy team. Johnson would also mention that no memorial oration or eulogy could more eloquently honor President Kennedy's memory than the earliest possible passage of the Civil Rights Bill for which he had fought so long. After a lengthy conservative filibuster, Congress at last passed the landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964. The act banned racial discrimination in most private facilities open to the public, including theaters, hospitals, and restaurants. It also strengthened the federal government's power to end segregation in schools and other public places. Johnson also rammed Kennedy's stalled tax bill through Congress and added proposals of his own for a $1 billion war on poverty. Johnson dubbed his domestic program the Great Society, a sweeping set of New Dealish economic and welfare measures aimed at transforming the American way of life. Tireless Johnson also prodded the Congress into creating two new cabinet offices, the Department of Transportation and the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Even more impressive were the Big Four legislative achievements that crowned LBJ's Great Society: aid to education, medical care for the elderly, immigration reform, and a new voting rights bill. With the last of the Big Four reforms, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, Johnson made heartening headway against one of the most persistent American evils, racial discrimination. The Civil Rights Act of 64 gave the federal government more muscle to enforce school desegregation orders and to prohibit racial discrimination in all kinds of public accommodations and employment. But the problem of voting rights still remained. So the 24th Amendment, ratified in January 1964, abolished the poll tax in federal elections. Blacks joined hands with white civil rights workers, many of them student volunteers from the North, in a massive voter registration drive in Mississippi during the Freedom Summer of 1964, singing "We Shall Overcome." In the election of 1964, Johnson's nomination by the Democrats was a foregone conclusion. The Republicans nominated box-jawed Senator Barry Goldwater of Arizona, an ultra-conservative. Johnson cultivated the contrasting image of a resolute statesman by seizing upon what happened in the Gulf of Tonkin, known as the Gulf of Tonkin episode, early in August. In this case, two American destroyers were allegedly fired upon by North Vietnamese in August. Johnson nevertheless promptly called the attack unprovoked and moved swiftly to make political hay out of this episode. Johnson used the incident to spur congressional passage of the all-purpose Tonkin Gulf Resolution. Lawmakers here virtually abdicated their war-declaring powers and handed the president a blank check to use further force in Southeast Asia. The Tonkin Gulf Resolution, was, in Johnson's words, like grandma's nightshirt. It covered everything. Goldwater attacked really all of LBJ's policies, thinking that they were too New Dealish and spending way too much money. Johnson's going to criticize Barry Goldwater as being somewhat trigger happy and trying to scare America from voting to him, that he's just going to press a button and we'll have nuclear war. Johnson obviously wins big time, 61% of the vote, and records also a huge victory in both houses. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 marked the end of an era in the history of the civil rights movement, the era of nonviolent demonstrations. As if to symbolize the turn of events, just 5 days after President Johnson signed the landmark voting law, a bloody riot erupted in Watts, a black ghetto in Los Angeles. Blacks, enraged by police brutality, burned and looted their own neighborhoods for nearly a week. The Watts explosion heralded a new phase of the black struggle, increasingly marked by militant confrontation, led by radical and sometimes violent spokespersons, and often aiming not at interracial cooperation, but at black separatism. The pious Christian moderation of Martin Luther King Jr. came under heavy fire from this second wave of younger black leaders who privately mocked the dignified Dr. King as the Lord. Malcolm X was at first inspired by the militant black nationalists in the Nation of Islam. Like the nation's founder, Elijah Muhammad, born Elijah Poole, Malcolm changed his surname to advertise his lost African identity in white America. He was a brilliant and charismatic preacher and trumpeted black separatism and protested strongly against what he called the blue-eyed white devils. Eventually, Malcolm X will distance himself from Elijah Muhammad's separatist preachings and move towards more mainstream Islam. Malcolm X began to preach a more conciliatory message as well, but in early 1965, he was cut down by rival Nation of Islam gunmen while speaking to a large crowd in New York City. With frightening frequency, violence or the threat of violence raised its head in the black community. The Black Panther Party openly brandished weapons in the streets of Oakland, California. The following year, Stokely Carmichael, a leader of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, urged the abandonment of peaceful demonstrations and instead promoted what was called Black Power. The very phrase Black Power unsettled many whites, and their fears increased when Stokely Carmichael was quoted as gloating that Black Power will smash everything Western civilization had created. African Americans, recollecting previous black nationalist movements like that of Marcus Garvey earlier in the century, breathed a vibrant separatist meaning into the concept of Black Power. They emphasized African American distinctiveness, promoted Afro hairstyles and dress, shed their white names for new African identities, and demanded Black studies programs in schools and universities. Despair deepened when the magnetic and moderate voice of Martin Luther King Jr. was forever silenced by a sniper bullet in Memphis, Tennessee on April 4th, 1968. A martyr for justice, he had bled and died against a peculiarly American thorn of race. The killing of King cruelly robbed the American people of one of the most inspirational leaders in their history, and especially at a time when they could least afford to lose him. In the election of 1968, the Democrats then went with Hubert Humphrey, and the Republicans kind of bring back to life Richard M. Nixon, and his vice presidential candidate will be Maryland's Governor Spiro Agnew. The independent George Wallace was from the South, and definitely wanted to bring segregation back. There'll actually be an assassination attempt on George Wallace's life. The result was Nixon winning 301 electoral votes, and Wallace amasses a large third-party popular vote, mostly because he pretty much gets the entire South to vote for him. As the 1960s lurched to a close, the fantastic quarter-century economic boom of the post-World War II era also showed signs of petering out. By increasing their productivity, American workers had doubled their average standard of living in the 25 years since the end of World War II. Now, fatefully, productivity gains slowed to the vanishing point. The entire decade of the 70s did not witness a productivity advance equivalent to even 1 year's progress in the preceding 2 decades. The median income of the average American family stagnated in the 2 decades after 1970. What caused the sudden slump in productivity? Some observers cited the increasing presence in the workforce of women and teenagers who typically had fewer skills than adult male workers and were less likely to take the full-time long-term jobs where skills might be developed. Other commentators blame declining investments in new machinery, the heavy costs of compliance with government-imposed safety and health regulations, and the general shift of the American economy from manufacturing to service. Yet, in the last analysis, much mystery attends the productivity slowdown. The Vietnam War also precipitated painful economic distortions. The disastrous conflict in Southeast Asia drained tax dollars from needed improvements in education, deflected scientific skill and manufacturing capacity from the civilian sector, and touched off a sickening spiral of inflation. Sharply rising oil prices in the 1970s also fed inflation, but its deepest roots lay in government policies of the 1960s, especially Lyndon Johnson's insistence on simultaneously fighting the war in Vietnam and funding the Great Society programs at home. all without a tax increase to finance the added expenditures. Both military spending and welfare spending are inherently inflationary because they put dollars in people's hands without adding to the supply of goods that those dollars can buy. And when too many dollars chase too few goods, prices rise, as they did astonishingly in the 1970s. Inaugurated on January in 1969, Richard Nixon urged the American people, torn with dissension over Vietnam and race relations, to stop shouting at one another. Nixon brought one huge, valuable asset with him to the White House: his broad knowledge and thoughtful experience in foreign affairs. The first burning need was to quiet the public uproar over Vietnam. President Nixon announced a policy called Vietnamization. It was to withdraw the 540,000 U.S. troops in South Vietnam over an extended period. The so-called Nixon Doctrine thus evolved. It proclaimed that the United States would honor its existing defensive commitments, but that in the future, Asians and others would have to fight their own wars without the support of large bodies of American ground troops. But even this much involvement was distasteful to the American doves, many of whom demanded a withdrawal right away. Nixon launched also his own home front counteroffensive. On November 3, 1969, he delivered a dramatic television appeal to the great silent majority, who presumably supported the war. Though ostensibly conciliatory, Nixon's appeal was in fact deeply divisive, as he sought to carve out a political constituency that would back his policies. Morale appeared to have plummeted to rock bottom when rumors filtered out of Vietnam that soldiers were fragging their own officers, murdering them with fragmentation grenades. Domestic disgust with the war was further deepened in 1970 by revelations that in 1968, American troops had massacred innocent women and children in the village of My Lai. For several years, the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong were allies, had been using Cambodia, bordering South Vietnam on the west, as a springboard for troops, weapons, and supplies. Suddenly, on April 29, 1970, without consulting Congress, Nixon ordered American forces to join with the South Vietnamese in cleaning out the enemy sanctuaries in officially neutral Cambodia. Restless students nationwide responded. Nixon withdrew the American troops from Cambodia on June 29, 1970, only after 2 months. At Kent State University in Ohio, jumpy members of the National Guard fired into a noisy crowd, killing 4 and wounding many more. At Jackson State College in Mississippi, the Highway Patrol discharged volleys at a student dormitory, killing 2 black students. Youth were similarly pleased, though, but not pacified, when the 26th Amendment in 1971 lowered the voting age to 18, but they still remain the lowest percentage of American voters to this day. In June 1971, the New York Times published a top-secret Pentagon study of America's involvement in the Vietnam War. These Pentagon papers, leaked to the Times by former Pentagon official Daniel Ellsberg, laid bare the blunders and deceptions of the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, especially the provoking of the 1964 North Vietnamese attack in the Gulf of Tonkin. As the anti-war firestorm flared even higher, Nixon concluded that the road out of Vietnam ran through Beijing and Moscow. He astutely perceived that the Chinese-Soviet tensions afforded the U.S. an opportunity to play one off the other, and to enlist the aid of both then in pressuring North Vietnam into peace. Nixon announced to a startled nation in July of '71 that he had accepted an invitation to visit China the following year. He made his historic journey in February of 1972. He next traveled to Moscow in May of 72 to play his China card in a game of high-stakes diplomacy in the Kremlin. The Soviets, hungry for American foodstuffs and alarmed over the possibility of intensified rivalry with the American-backed China, were ready to deal. Nixon's visit ushered in an era of what's called détente, or relaxed tension with the two communist powers. Détente resulted in several significant agreements. One product of eased relations was the Great Grain Deal of 72, which was a 3-year arrangement by which the food-rich United States agreed to sell the Soviets at least $750 million worth of wheat, corn, and other cereals. Far more important were steps to stem the dangerous, frantic competition in nuclear arms. Surprisingly, Nixon presided over significant expansions of the welfare program that conservative Republicans routinely denounced. He approved increased appropriations for entitlements like food stamps and Medicaid, as well as the largest federal welfare program, Aid to Families with Dependent Children, which especially targeted single mothers and younger children. He implemented a new federal program, Supplemental Security Income, SSI, which gave generous benefits to the indigent, aged, blind, and disabled. He signed legislation in 72 that raised Social Security old age pensions and provided for automatic increases when the cost of living rose more than 3% in a year. Nixon's generous expansion of Great Society programs helped reduce the nation's poverty rate to 11% in 73, its lowest level in modern history. And he also did the Great Society one better in his attack on racial discrimination. His so-called Philadelphia Plan in 1969 required construction trade union working on federal contracts in Philadelphia to establish goals and timetables for the hiring of black apprentices. The president's new policy had far-reaching implications. The Philadelphia Plan, in effect, required thousands of employers to meet hiring quotas or to establish set-asides for minority subcontractors. Nixon's Philadelphia Plan drastically altered the meaning of affirmative action. Lyndon Johnson had intended affirmative action to protect individuals against discrimination. Nixon now transformed and escalated affirmative action into a program that conferred privileges on certain groups. And the Supreme Court went along with Nixon's approach in Griggs v. Duke Power Company in 71. The justices prohibited intelligence tests or other devices that had the effect of excluding minorities or women from certain jobs. The court's ruling strongly suggested that only sure protection against charges of discrimination was to hire minority workers or admit minority students in proportion to their presence in the population. They also opened a Pandora's box of protests because critics assailed this new style of affirmative action as reverse discrimination. Among the other major legacies of the Nixon year was the creation of in 1970 of the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, and a companion body, the Occupational Health and Safety Administration, or OSHA. Author Rachel Carson gave the environmental movement a huge boost in 1962 when she published her book, Silent Spring, an enormously effective piece of latter-day muckraking that exposed the poisonous effects of pesticides. Legislatively armed by the Clean Air Act of 1970, the Endangered Species Act of 73, and similar laws, EPA and OSHA stood in the front line of the battle of ecological sanity. The election of 72, Nixon is reelected over South Dakota Senator George McGovern. He won all states but Massachusetts, but he lost the majority in the House and the Senate. After the fighting on both sides, as we look at North Vietnamese bombing, had escalated, Nixon launched a furious 2-week bombing of North Vietnam in an iron-handed effort to force the North Vietnamese back to the conference table. This attack was the heaviest of the war and resulted in substantial losses of American big B-52 bombers. But this merciless pounding drove the North Vietnamese negotiators to agree to ceasefire arrangements in January of 73, nearly 3 months after peace was prematurely proclaimed. Nixon hailed the face-saving ceasefire agreement as peace with honor, but the boast rang kind of hollow. The United States was going to withdraw its remaining 27,000 or so troops and could reclaim some 560 American prisoners of war. South Vietnam would be permitted to continue receiving limited U.S. support, but no more U.S. fighting forces. Ominously, the North Vietnamese still occupied about 30% of South Vietnam. The shaky peace was in reality a little more than a thinly disguised American retreat. Nixon's electoral triumph was soon made kind of dirty by the so-called Watergate scandals. On June 17, 1972, some 2 months before his renomination, a bungled burglary had occurred in the Democratic headquarters located in a Watergate apartment office complex in Washington. 5 men were arrested inside the building with electronic bugging equipment in their possession, working for the Republican Committee for the Re-election of the President, which was interestingly known as CREEP. They found them to be, they were also engaged in a number of dirty tricks. In other words, campaign espionage and sabotage, including fake documents directed against Democratic candidates in the campaign of '72. The Watergate break-in was only the tip of the iceberg in a slimy sea of corruption that made the Grant and Harding scandals look almost respectable. Several prominently placed White House aides and advisors were even forced to resign. Many were involved in the criminal obstruction of justice through tangled cover-ups of payments of hush money. By early '74, 29 people had been indicted and had pleaded guilty or had been convicted of Watergate-related crimes. The scandal in Washington also provoked the improper or illegal use of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, and the CIA. The IRS was called upon by Nixon's aides to audit or otherwise harass political opponents and others who had fallen into disfavor. In the name of national security, Nixon's aides had authorized a burglary of the files of Dr. Daniel Ellsberg, psychiatrist. So great was the determination to destroy the man who had leaked the Pentagon Papers. Nixon, of course, had emphatically denied prior knowledge of the Watergate burglary or involvement in the cover-up. He took refuge behind various principles, including separation of powers and executive privilege, but all of them were at least constitutionally dubious, especially when invoked to cover up crime obstacles. Responding at last to the House Judiciary Committee's demand for the Watergate tapes, Nixon agreed in the spring of '74 to the publication of relevant portions of the tapes, but substantial sections of the wanted tapes were actually missing. Confronted with demands for the rest of the material, Nixon flatly refused. And on July 24, 1974, Nixon suffered a disastrous setback when the Supreme Court unanimously ruled that executive privilege gave him no right to withhold from the special prosecutor portions of tapes relevant to the criminal activities. Nixon reluctantly complied. He voluntarily took steps on August 5, 1974, that had a devastating effect on what remained of his credibility. He now made public 3 subpoenaed tapes of conversations with his chief aide on July 23, 1972. One of them had him giving orders 6 days after the Watergate break-in to use the CIA to hold back an inquiry by the FBI. Now, Nixon's own tape-recorded words convicted him of having been an active part to the attempted cover-up, in itself the crime of obstructing justice. This was known as the smoking gun tape. Articles of impeachment were then printed, which said Nixon had obstructed justice, abused the power of the president, and was in contempt of Congress. Republican leaders urged him to resign, telling him that if convicted by the Senate, he would lose all his normal retirement benefits, and that they couldn't stop it. And so Nixon, choking back his tears, announced his resignation in a dramatic television appearance on August 8th, 1974. In July 73, America was shocked to learn that the U.S. Air Force had already secretly conducted some 3,500 bombing raids against North Vietnamese positions in Cambodia. The most disturbing feature of these sky forays was that while they were going on, American officials, including the president, were avowing that Cambodian neutrality was being respected. Congressional opposition to the expansion of presidential war-making powers by Johnson and Nixon led to what was called the War Powers Act of '73. Passed over Nixon's veto, it required the president to report to Congress within 48 hours after committed troops to a foreign conflict or substantially enlarging American combat units in a foreign country, compelling Nixon to end the bombing of Cambodia in August of '73. It was one manifestation of what then became called the new isolationism in America. The draft had ended in January '73, although it was retained on standby basis. Adding to Nixon's problem, the long rumbling Middle East erupted anew in October '73 when the rearmed Syrians and Egyptians unleashed surprise attacks on Israel in an attempt to regain the territory that they lost in the Six-Day War of 1967. Kissinger, the Secretary of State, quickly flew to Moscow in an effort to restrain the Soviets who were arming the attackers. Believing that the Kremlin was poised to fly combat troops to the Suez area, Nixon placed America's nuclear forces on alert and ordered a gigantic airlift of nearly $2 billion in war materials to the Israelis. This assistance helped save the day, but it kind of made things uneasy in the Middle East for the United States. America's policy of backing Israel against its oil-rich neighbors had a huge penalty. Late in October '73, the Arab nations suddenly clamped an embargo on oil for the United States and for other countries supporting Israel. The 5 months of the Arab blackmail in '74 signaled the end of an era, the era of cheap and abundant energy. A 20-year surplus of world oil supplies had masked the fact that since 1948, the U.S. had been a net importer of oil. American oil production peaked in 1970 and then began an irreversible decline. The Middle Eastern sheiks, flexing their economic muscle through OPEC, approximately quadrupled their price for crude oil after lifting the embargo in 1974. Huge new oil bills widely disrupted the U.S. balance of international trade and added further fuel to the already raging fires of inflation. The United States took the lead in forming the International Energy Agency in '74 as a counterweight to OPEC. In various sectors of the country, including Detroit's car makers, began their slow, grudging adjustment to the rudely dawning age of energy dependence. Gerald Ford, the first man to be made president solely by a vote of Congress, entered the besmirched, you might say, White House in August 1974 with serious handicaps. The sour odor of illegitimacy just hung about this president without precedent. And then out of the clear sky, Ford granted a complete pardon to Nixon for any crimes he may have committed as president, discovered or undiscovered, and Democrats were outraged. They heatedly charged without persuasive evidence that Ford was carrying out a buddy deal that had been cooked up when Nixon nominated him for the vice presidency. Ford explained that he only wanted to end Nixon's private agony, heal the festering wounds in the body politic, and let the country get on with its business undistracted by a possible sensational trial. But lingering suspicions about the circumstances of the pardon cast a dark shadow over Ford's prospect of being elected president in his own right in 1976. Early in 1975, President Ford urged Congress to vote still more weapons for Vietnam, but his plea was in vain, and without the crutch of massive American aid, the South Vietnamese quickly and ingloriously collapsed. The dam burst so rapidly that the remaining Americans had to be frantically evacuated by helicopters, the last of them on April 29, 1965, and that's a picture of that on the right there. About 140,000 South Vietnamese, most of them so dangerously identified with the Americans that they feared a bloodbath by the victorious communists. Ford compassionately admitted these people to the United States, where they added further seasoning to the melting pot. Eventually, some 500,000 would arrive. The United States had fought the North Vietnamese to a standstill and had then withdrawn its troops in 1973, leaving the South Vietnamese to fight their own war. The estimated cost to America was about $118 billion in current monies today, together with some 56,000 dead and some 300,000 wounded. The United States had also lost face in the eyes of foreigners, lost its own self-esteem, lost confidence in its military prowess, and lost much of the economic muscle that had made possible its global leadership since World War II. The anti-war movement, like many of the other protest movements that convulsed the country in the 60s, had long since splintered and stalled. One major exception to this pattern stood out, although they had their differences. American feminists showed vitality and momentum. They won legislative and judicial victories and provoked an intense rethinking of gender roles. In 1972, Congress passed Title IX of the Education Amendments, prohibiting sex discrimination in any federally assisted educational program or activity. Perhaps this act's biggest impact was to create opportunities for girls and women's athletics at schools and colleges, giving birth to a new Title IX generation that would reach maturity in the 1980s and 1990s and help professionalize women's sports. The Equal Rights Amendment, ERA, to the Constitution won congressional approval in 1972. It declared equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged to the United States or by any state on account of sex. And in the landmark case of Roe v. Wade in 1973, the court struck down laws prohibiting abortion, arguing that a woman's decision to terminate a pregnancy was protected by the constitutional right of privacy. For many feminists, the most bitter defeat was the death of the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment. With ratification by 38 state legislatures, the amendment would have become part of the Constitution. Conservative spokeswoman Phyllis Schlafly led the campaign to stop the ERA. Its advocates, she charged, were just bitter women seeking a constitutional cure for their personal problems. In 1979, Congress extended the deadline for ratification, but ERA opponents dug in their heels, and the amendment died in 1982, 3 states short of success. President Jimmy Carter. As a committed Christian, President Carter displayed from the outset an overriding concern for human rights as the guiding principle for his foreign policy. His most spectacular foreign policy achievement came in September 78 at a place called Camp David. Relations between Egypt and Israel had deteriorated so far that another blow-up in the misery-drenched Middle East seemed imminent. So grave was the danger that Carter courageously risked humiliating failure by inviting President Anwar Sadat of Egypt and Prime Minister Menachem Begin of Israel to a summit conference at Camp David with him. Serving as the go-between, Carter, after 13 days, persuaded the 2 visitors to sign an accord that held considerable promise of peace. Israel agreed in principle to withdraw from territory conquered in the 1967 war, and Egypt in return promised to respect Israel's borders. The president crowned the diplomatic success by resuming full diplomatic relations with China in early 1979. After a nearly 30-year interruption, Carter also successfully proposed 2 treaties turning over complete ownership and control of the Panama Canal to the Panamanians by the year 2000. To Carter's mushrooming troubles was the failing health of the economy. Prices had been rising feverishly, increasing at a rate of more than 10% a year by 1974. Crippling oil price hikes from OPEC in that same year dealt the reeling economy another huge body blow. A stinging recession during Gerald Ford's presidency brought the inflation rate down a little bit, but virtually from the moment of Carter's inauguration, prices resumed their dizzying ascent, driving the inflation rate well above 13% by 1979. The oil shocks of the 1970s taught Americans a painful but necessary lesson: that they could never again seriously consider a policy of economic isolation. America's foreign trade had accounted for no more than 10% of gross national product, GNP, but huge foreign oil bills drove that figure steadily upward in the 1970s and thereafter. By the century's end, some 27% of the GNP depended on foreign trade. The nation's new economic interdependence meant that the U.S. could not dominate international trade and finance as easily as it had in the post-World War II decades. Yawning deficits in the federal budget, reaching nearly $60 billion in 1980, further aggravated the U.S. economy's inflationary ailments. Even in events in Iran jolted Americans out of their complacency about energy supplies in 1979. Imperious Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, installed as the Shah of Iran with help from America's CIA in 1953, had long ruled his oil-rich land with a will of steel. His repressive regime was finally overthrown in January of '79. Violent revolutions was spearheaded in Iran by Muslim fundamentalists who fiercely resented the Shah's campaign to westernize his country. The crippling upheaval soon spread to Iran's oil fields. As Iranian oil stopped flowing into the stream of world commerce, shortages appeared, and OPEC again seized the opportunity to hike petroleum prices. Americans once more found themselves waiting impatiently in long lines at gas stations or buying gasoline only on specific days. June 1979, President Carter will meet with Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev in Vienna to sign the long-stalled SALT II agreements, limiting the levels of lethal strategic weapons in the Soviet and American arsenals. Political earthquake in the petroleum-rich Persian Gulf region finally buried all hopes of ratifying the SALT II treaty. On November 4th in '79, a howling mob of rabidly anti-American Muslim militants stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, Iran, and took all of its occupying hostages. World opinion hotly condemned the diplomatic felony on Iran, while Americans agonized over both the fate of the hostages and the stability of the entire Persian Gulf region, so dangerously close to the Soviet Union. The Soviet Army then aroused the West's worst fears in December of '79 when it blitzed into the mountainous nation of Afghanistan next door to Iran. Carter slapped an embargo on the export of grain and high-technology machinery to the USSR and also called for a boycott of the upcoming Olympic Games in Moscow. He grimly conceded that he had misjudged the Soviets, and the SALT II treaty became a dead letter in the Senate. Carter at last ordered a daring rescue mission, a highly trained commando team, penetrating deep into Iran's sandy interior. Their plan required tic-tac perfection to succeed. And when equipment failures prevented some members of the team from reaching their destination, the mission had to be scrapped. As the commandos withdrew in the dark, two of their aircraft collided, killing 8 of the would-be rescuers. The episode seemed to underscore the nation's helplessness and even incompetence in the face of a mortifying insult to the national honor. The stalemate with Iran dragged on throughout the rest of Carter's term, providing an embarrassing backdrop to the embattled president's struggle for re-election. And in that re-election, Democrats will kind of begrudgingly take Jimmy Carter. The Republicans go with Ronald Reagan and George Bush. Reagan attacked the performance of Carter's foreign policy and is really the first elected president to be, is the first elected president to be unseated by voters since Hoover. Carter's farewell stressed his efforts to scale down the deadly arms race, to promote human rights, and to protect the environment. Reagan's arrival in Washington was triumphal. The Iranians contributed to the festive mood by releasing the hostages on Reagan's inauguration day, January 20th, 1981, after 444 days of captivity. Reagan assembled a conservative cabinet of the best and the brightest and relied on these and other advisors to make important decisions. A major goal of Reagan's political career was to reduce the size of the government by shrinking the federal government and slashing taxes. He declared, "Government is not the solution to our problem, it's the problem." After 4 decades of advancing New Deal and Great Society programs, a strong countercurrent took hold. California staged a tax revolt in 1978, known by its official ballot title as Proposition 13, that slashed property taxes and forced painful cuts in government services. This California tax quake jolted other state capitals and even rocked the pillars of Congress in faraway D.C. Ronald Reagan had ridden this political shockwave to the presidential victory in 1980 and now proceeded to rattle the welfare state to its very foundation. He proposed a new federal budget that necessitated cuts of some $35 billion, mostly in social programs like food stamps and federally funded job training centers. But to get his way in the Democratic House, he undertook some old-fashioned politicking. He enterprisingly wooed a group of mostly Southern conservative Democrats dubbed boll weevils, who abandoned their own party's leadership to follow President Reagan. Then on March 6, 1981, a deranged gunman shot the president as he was leaving a Washington hotel. A .22 caliber bullet penetrated beneath Reagan's left arm and collapsed his left lung. Reagan seemed to recover rapidly from this violent ordeal. 12 days after the attack, he walked out of the hospital and returned to work. When he appeared a few days later on national television to address the Congress and the public on his budget, the outpouring of sympathy and support was strong.